Hello, hello, hello. So we want to get things started. We can't wait any longer. Our students, our faculty have been preparing for weeks, if not months, for this day. So let us begin. Good morning and welcome to the annual Spring Symposium of the Graduate Program in Visual and Critical Studies, called VCS for short. VCS is in the Humanities and Science Division at California College of the Arts. My name is Jasmin Darznik, and I'm the chair of the VCS MA program and the writing program at CCA. By way of acknowledgement, I must state that the campuses of California College of the Arts here in San Francisco are located within the occupied territories of traditional and unceded Ohlone land. Today, VCS holds its annual Spring Symposium. It is a great day for our program. It is the culminating public event for our emerging scholars in the VCS class of 2025. Sloane Holzer, you can clap raucously. Giorgie O'Keefe DePaolis. Hiura. Yunfei and Vanessa Pérez. Before we move on to the presentations, allow me to say a bit about VCS's program and to thank those who support it. The VCS Master of Arts program is a 2-year program. For students who are interested in earning a second terminal master's degree in writing and fine arts at CCA, there is an option of a 3-year program. Working with our dynamic faculty, VCS students take seminars in philosophy, art history, and visual culture, and theories of identity, place, and the modes of perception. The coursework builds skills in research and advances the strategies of presenting one's discoveries to audiences. Towards these ends, students complete a 30-page master's thesis. They also write a shorter 2,500-word essay based on the thesis and published in our Sightlines journal. And I hope you got one of these. They're beautiful, the green-bound journals. They also produce a thesis exhibition poster. You'll see these today during the panel, introductions, and during the breaks. Lastly, they publicly present their research at the annual Spring Symposium. In sum, VCS training prepares them for careers in the arts and in the cultural industry at large. VCS thanks the CCA President, David C. Howes, Interim Provost T.T. Takamoto, and Dean of the Humanities and Sciences Division, Dr. Jacqueline Francis, for their support of our program. I am also grateful for the support of Renee Bruckner. Get around for Renee. This is also a good time for raucous applause. Assistant Director, Renee is Assistant Director in the H&S Division, and also that of Chris McGee. H&S Project Manager. We also thank the work study students who support the event and many others during the academic year. VCS also thanks all of the staff, administrators, facilities workers, and public safety officers who help us get our work across the CCA campus. Last but not least, I thank all of my CCA faculty colleagues, and in particular, those who advise this year's graduating cohort. On behalf of the students, I'd like to cite the mentorship of Neil, where's Neil? Neil Gooden Bakhtiar, who created research plans and guided the students during their summer's thesis research and writing workshop. Master's Project Thesis Director Cindy Bello, who supervised the writing of the master's theses and the sidelines essays during the academic year 2024-2025. Lastly, faculty advisors for all of these students shared their expertise with students here at CCA. They were Gun Bayraktar, Genevieve Hyacinth, Patricia Lang, Patricia's there, Jeanette Roan, and Michael Washington. All right, now I want to hand it over to Professor Cindy Bello. As I just stated, Cindy was the thesis director for this year's VCS graduating cohort. The thesis director in the VCS program is an expert, critical, critical thinker and reader versed in visual and critical studies broadly. The thesis director helps students articulate their ideas and refine their theoretical and methodological approaches to the research process. The thesis director helps the students stay on track and prepare for days like today. Professor Bello is so well equipped for this important role in the VCS faculty. Her research interests include hemispheric cultural studies, critical theories of decoloniality, feminism, performance and aesthetics, human rights, and memory studies. Please welcome Professor Bello, who will offer her comments on the students' endeavor during the 2024-2025 academic year.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 VCS Spring Symposium. This event brings us together as we near the end of what has been an exhausting and turbulent academic year, which has impacted the CCA community in ways personal, political, and institutional. I had the privilege of working closely with this year's VCS cohort as they balanced the exigencies of this moment with the demanding work of completing their degrees. As the thesis director for both the fall and spring sections of the Master's Project Seminar, I accompanied these students on multiple journeys, writing and researching a 30-page thesis, converting their thesis into a short-form essay for the VCS Sidelines Journal, preparing for and successfully passing their candidacy reviews, and preparing a public presentation of their research for this symposium. Witnessing the resilience and dedication of these students as they work together to navigate the rigors of this process was a lesson in the insurgent work of writing as a practice of radical attunement. Attunement to the aesthetic contours of images and cultural productions that arrest us in their ability to offer new ways of knowing, feeling, and sensing the histories and experiences that have shaped our lives. Attunement to the possibilities of their own voices as instruments of truth, transformation, and dissent, and attunement to the needs of one another as they embarked upon the intimate and vulnerable work of building intellectual community. I watched in admiration as they took responsibility for not only their own growth as scholars, but for the growth of their colleagues, approaching the thesis process with an expanded sense of accountability for the thriving and well-being of the collective. I watched as they held each other with humor and empathy through waves of flow and frustration, as they came to know each other's projects as well as their own, and as they reminded each other of the immeasurable value of their ideas during moments of doubt. Their presentations today issue an invitation to us to enter into the world that they have been writing towards, a world united in the understanding that we are all always intimately responsible for one another. I give my thanks to Jasmin Darznik, the chair of Graduate Writing and Literature, who has been stewarding the VCS program over the past year, to Humanities and Sciences Dean Jacqueline Francis, who works tirelessly to provide guidance, support, and encouragement to students as the program lead for VCS, and to the extended VCS family that served as thesis advisors to the students, Professors Michael Washington, Patricia Lang, Gun Bayraktar, Jeanette Roan, and Genevieve Hyacinth. I also thank Chris McGee and Renee Brooker for going above and beyond to keep the VCS machine running, and for what seemed to be their constant availability and willingness to help troubleshoot any issues that came up over the past year. I give my gratitude especially to the 2025 VCS cohort, Sloane Holzer, Giorgie DePaolis, Sam Hiura, Yunfei Hua, and Vanessa Pérez Winder, for sharing their brilliance with us and for providing us with the occasion to come together, take a breath, and be reminded of why spaces like these are so important. Lastly, I would like to thank everyone in the audience for showing up today to be enthusiastic interlocutors for these wonderful projects that have been months, years, lifetimes, and generations in the making. And with that, I'll turn things back to Chair Jasmin Darznik, who'll be moderating our first panel.
Can't do anything without Jackie. Hello again, and thank you, Cindy. That was just lovely. Great way to kick off these panels. The title of panel 1 is Contested Sites, Bodies, Cities, and Families. Our panelists are Sloane Holzer, Giorgie DePaolis, and Sam Hiura. Their full biographies are in the printed program. Here's a preview of their presentations and short introductions to them. Sloane Holzer is a writer and artist who has previously published her written and creative work in BOMB, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Based Journal, and Them. Here at CCA, she is a candidate in the two graduate programs, two graduate programs, writing and VCS. The title of her symposium paper is Raised and Pink on Scar Tissue, Trans Surgery, and White Womanhood. Giorgie DePaolis is a second-year master's candidate in the VCS program. They have curated 5 exhibitions in the 2024-2025 year. They directed CCA's Play Space Gallery. They study the relationship between San Francisco, its aesthetic iconography, and the underlying social action that these visuals represent. The title of Giorgie's symposium paper is San Francisco, Aesthetics of Belonging. Sam Hiura is an interdisciplinary curator and writer whose critical and curatorial pursuits lie in actualizing contemporary art as a site of undoing and unsettling. She is completing an MA in curatorial practice and an MA in VCS. The title of Sam's symposium piece is Strange Silence, What Accumulates in Kenneth Tom's Sump. All right, a reminder, which is to please hold your questions for the presenters in panel 1 after all of these panelists have presented. Please jot your questions down, and at the end we'll have 15 minutes of discussion and Q&A. Sloane will start us off.
Hear me okay? Great, awesome. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm very honored to be a part of this really incredible VCS cohort. In 2019, in the basement of a hospital building in Oakland, a social worker at my gender care clinic asks me about my upcoming plans for sex reassignment surgery. As we're wrapping up our meeting, he asks almost offhandedly if I'm interested in FFS, or facial feminization surgery. I had a passing familiarity, but I was unaware that it could be covered by insurance. I said yes, I was interested. Once I arrived home, I looked at before and after pictures of trans women who had undergone FFS. I began to imagine my life through the lens of this surgery. The discomfort I felt in my body had just been offered a focal point, a singular desire towards which it could sharpen itself, a medically approved, insurance-covered outcome to cure my gender dysphoria. The same year I had FFS, an artwork debuted online. In the 2020 interactive website / archival video game titled I Can't Remember a Time I Didn't Need You by the artist Daniel Brathwaite Shirley, the work requires more than participation. It demands implication. At the beginning of the game, I am told that I need to register before I can access anything else. Via interior monologue, this request is understood as uncomfortable, violating even. You really don't like filling out papers about your identity, the text offers. This perspective can be your perspective if one chooses to occupy the subject position of you. My subject position is constituted by my citizenship status, my whiteness, my transness, and the surgical interventions I've chosen to pursue as a part of said transness. Surgery, like any of the aforementioned markers of identity, is not neutral, nor is it something which can be divorced from the histories of extraordinary violence which modern medicine holds. I am not the first to argue that transness, like cissexual gender, is fundamentally shaped by racialization. But I want to extend this argument further. I see trans surgery as a technique which reinforces medical relationalities, producing material changes which are linked to manifestations of white supremacy. White trans women's public advertising of the benefits of surgical intervention has helped to concentrate the power of medicine over all trans women's embodiment. See Christine Jorgensen, one of the most famous white trans women ever, notable for the way her surgical interventions publicly confirmed her as desirable. Even contemporary pop star Kim Petras' status as one of the youngest people to ever receive sex reassignment surgery, alongside her hypersexualized lyrics and public image, advertises surgery's capacity to produce desirability via medicine. This commercialization of the trans libidinal economy intends to produce better women, women who are desirous in their ability to pass, or to be visually undifferentiated from cis women. To put it simply, surgery tells trans women what their bodies can become, and an overwhelming majority of the time, these aesthetic decisions reinforce white supremacist narratives about how binary gender looks. For instance, Dr. Douglas Osterhout, the surgeon who initially developed the techniques for FFS, gathered the maxillofacial measurements which he felt constituted a normal skull from the work of 20th century biological anthropologists who considered race an externally measurable category. These measurements were then chipped, scraped, and carved into the bone and tissue of trans women in order to make them legibly feminine, a form of cosmetic beauty drawn out of racialization's metrics. Ben Miller, writer, historian, and co-host of the podcast Bad Gaze, states that any conversation about surgery and transness should not seek to condemn medicalized trans individuals. Instead, he encourages thinking with nuance and criticality about how queer subjectivities, when they collaborate with power, are transformed by that power. In C. Riley Snorton's groundbreaking work, Black on Both Sides, the critical historian puts forth an analysis of Black trans subjects living within America. The astonishing violence of gynecology's origins, in which J. Marion Sims developed surgical techniques on enslaved African women, were then used to alleviate the suffering of white women. Snorton assesses how these techniques, when drawn from bodies treated as unfeeling flesh, developed the hospital as laboratory, where gender and racialized difference were invented at the point where scalpel met skin. In Lauren Berlant's text, Cruel Optimism, the theorist argues that history might be best understood as experientially felt. This model of feeling history is crucial for this project. Using my embodied experience of transition as a lens, I hope to document what Berlant calls centralized epistemologies, or methods of understanding produced within the body senses. I click through the start of I Can't Remember. I've played it multiple times before, but it is my first time since my third transition-related surgery in August of 2023. It always begins the same, reaching the city of dreams, seen here. Neon lights advertise its appeal, and the narrative voice confirms it as a place where someone might be able to learn who they can become. The possibility of change contained within the city is a dynamic which has long characterized trans people's move toward urban centers. I know this because my own move to the Bay Area, like so many of my trans friends, was done so with the explicit understanding that trans life is easier to live here. Once inside the registration office, a disembodied face looms out of the dark to greet me. I am informed that a fog has descended, an atmosphere designed to support Black trans life, but it comes with a warning, whether the fog will support you or if you are the reason the fog has come. Yet Brathwaite surely did not design this work for a singular perspective. Rather, it is focused on constructing an archive of life. Experiencing the work shifts based on who chooses to navigate through it, how they register their perspective, and which choices they make. Will you choose to join a protest, dance in a nightclub, or pick up your prescriptions? The face in the office tells every newcomer that what's revealed to your gaze will depend on how you identify. In the office, I am given the imperfect privilege of choice. My name, gender, and race are all asked for. I tell the registration office that I am trans, and they offer me a warm welcome, one I assume is worded differently than if I had chosen one of the cisgender options. The face in the office then asks me if I'm Black. I answer honestly and say no. My perspective is registered, framed as one which will shape how I navigate through the city. In this fog-wrapped digital environment, both similar and so different from San Francisco, white life, even white trans life, is not given the same default status of primacy. In the monograph, A Short History of Transmisogyny by Jules Gill Peterson, the academic chronicles two newspaper profiles of Mary Jones and Sally Benz. Both were trans sex workers in pre-abolition 19th century New York City. Jones' profile is defined by violent racist caricature. But for Benz, despite being misgendered, Gill Peterson sees the work as reflective of the newspaper's, quote, darling prostitute profiles. In New York, a city with its own rich histories of trans life-making, racialized subjectivity is reinforced, in part, through language. In Brathwaite Shirley's landscape, all caps text marks identity via registration and experience. I assume that Sally Benn's life was imperfectly shaped by her gender, in much the same way that my own life has been. But my whiteness, like Ben's, reads a certain framing onto my body, shaping how I understand the world, and in turn, how I am understood by it. I leave the registration office and head to the pharmacy. This pharmacy offers something called the Aisle of Life, which it claims will give you what you need to live your truth. The language of neoliberal trans representation is present here, a flimsy belonging defined by pithy taglines like embracing one's real self or declarations of being born this way. Frequently, trans representation's positivity obfuscates difficult material reality. In the claustrophobic halls of the pharmacy, an unseen voice asks me what I want. The possibility of change lures me in. I am given options rather than afforded self-description or self-determination. Only certain choices are offered. In our world, only certain surgeries and hormone regimens are prescribed, insured, or accessible. I pick one inaccurate option and I am given a How to Become Sloane book. Though the narrative voice admits that I might not need the guide, sometimes it can be so affirming to be given structuring logics. If one stays too long in the pharmacy, the menacing Dr. Curiosity emerges from the shadows. Wielding a scalpel made of light, he looms over you, wondering aloud what kind of work he can perform. This moment holds a centralized epistemology for trans people who experience medicine's hostile architecture, a place where limited choice constrains trans life and feeling to the narrow window of the pathologized. I'm reminded of the moment before anesthesia puts me to sleep in 2020, or 2022, or 2023, trusting the future of my body in the hands of cis strangers. The digitized figure of Dr. Curiosity harkens back to the legacies of Sims and Osterhout. These real medical professionals are also inquisitive, unrelenting in their quest to produce personhood, no matter the pain or discarded bodies required. It is a desire to use the hospital as a laboratory of creation, an in order to enable one of trans medical care's most frightening promises, access to the beauty, or at least discomfort-free existence of white women. As he inches towards you, text covers Dr. Curiosity. The clear and defined letters in his monologue remain uninterrupted, but a voice that seems to be shaking, blurred almost beyond legibility, appears just below. Have you ever been asked to show your doctor a part of your body for no reason? My doctors made me bare myself just to see my body. I have no idea what to do. This first-person speaker is never credited. I do not know if this text is offered to everyone or only to those who select their gender in the registration office as trans. Even something as small as testimony can offer language as a connection, a stretched hand requesting solidarity. Yet the outcomes for racialized trans life are impossible to ignore. I have seen self-interested white trans women regard medicine as a benevolent provider or praise the rights-granting power of the state as their protector. Here, on the screen, I'm showing you one of my scars. A thin band of tissue, raised and pink, which sits a few inches from my heart. The skin around this scar is still largely numb to the touch. This tissue is a locus around which I have thought through the questions in this work. As theorist Judith Butler offers in their text Precarious Lives, to be injured means that one has a chance to reflect upon injury, to find out who else suffers and in what ways. Perhaps, even in the grief and disappointment I have felt in witnessing white trans women's violent self-interest, the insensitivity of scar tissue can be a guide toward deeper connection. Who is moved to find new ways of feeling toward one another, and who revels in the numbness of scar tissue, which trans surgery helps facilitate. I see the projected optimism attached to trans surgery as a cruel one. According to Berlant, a person can become, quote, bound to a situation of profound threat that is at the same time profoundly confirming. Brathwaite Shirley's work, through its narrow choices and narrow medical hallways, understands medicine as a force every trans person forms a compulsory relationship with or against, by illustrating the cruelty attached to what is often framed as a purely optimistic relation. When I became armed with the knowledge of FFS, I internalized the sense that my face was the culprit of my joy. I learned to see my jawbone's protrusion as a physical manifestation of deficiency. My body became something to cure, to rein in, to make satisfyingly feminine. Whatever visions of self I had held before were subsumed by the indestructible certainty offered by trans surgery. These are the stakes for trans life. To be taught to imagine that nothing else but surgery will fix you, and to ignore how medical definitions of trans life have and might continue to exist as profoundly confirming threats. Cruel optimism is charted as a scene of fantasy, one where you expect, quote, that this time, nearness to this thing will help you become different in just the right way. I, like all trans people, exist as a permanently potential patient. Another possible consumer to whom an optimistic attachment about becoming new and different in just the right way is being sold. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming to the VCS Symposium. I will be presenting my research on San Franciscan aesthetics of belonging. Earlier last year, I entered an unfamiliar apartment in San Francisco's Mission District. The loft had assumed its alter ego, a do-it-yourself venue called Uzai Gallery. That night, the gallery hosted Fancy Art Show, an exhibition featuring the wood-inspired paintings of local artist Cole Skaggs. The show also featured other local artisans, including a tea pourer, a DJ, and a plant vendor. The gallery engaged visitors in social and creative activity with an arts and crafts table. Coursing through the hallways and open rooms, I felt a fizz, gaiety, spontaneity. This excitement reflected off trinkets and ephemera, disco balls and blindfolded statues. The eccentric glow pulsing throughout Uzai mirrored my imagination of San Francisco as a down-to-earth, alternative metropolis, a past that exists conveniently out of my own memory's reach. In those moments, I considered the value and meaning of cities as geographies with distinct offerings, and the value and meaning of San Francisco as a city that has undergone existential identity transformations within the last 3 decades. For me, Fancy Art Show evoked the texture of pre-Y2K counterculture in San Francisco, a similarity I investigated by looking at how Uzai Gallery generates familiarity and hospitality in the art scene through domestic interiors. The material relics of personality in the gallery, by which I mean trinkets, ephemera, and miscellaneous interior things, posed key resemblances to the iconography that Chloe Sherman archives through room photos in her collection, Renegades, San Francisco, the 1990s. These seen parallels between Sherman and Uzai correspond to respective unseen social interventions, as Sherman documented a community of queer mutual support in SF's 1990s, and Uzai works to use San Francisco as a harbor for the socially placeless. Cole Skaggs and Uzai Gallery choreographed Fancy Art Show in such a way that foregrounded audience participation alongside the aesthetic tradition of spectatorship. In this shot, we see 3 components of Fancy Art Show: Skaggs' paintings, the craft table, and the dance floor. Michelle Castillo, a performance photographer and friend of the gallerists, captured this shot, demonstrating dynamism and interpersonal energy alive in the gallery that night. In tight proximity with Skaggs' exhibition, guests crafted their own art while connecting with each other. A couple cuddles in the shades to the left. The dance floor suggests a kinetic alternative to spoken conversation, punctuated by the lone dancer in the photo. These aspects, insulated from the rest of the show, alchemize the living room into a venue of relationships, co-creation, and aesthetic celebration. Nicholas Boryag's mid-90s theory of relational aesthetics helps us understand the significance of conviviality in Fancy Art Show, documented here in Castillo's action shot. Relational aesthetics, a dated but useful starting point in understanding the relevance of Fancy Art Show in the 21st century, interprets interactive art projects that seek to inspire live human interconnection as experiments that test the translation between aesthetics and relationships. Props, material objects may occupy space, but art is born of audience participation. In Fancy Art Show, Castillo's documentation of paintings, dancing, conversation, and audience creation visualize the relational interests of the show. Fancy Art Show's interior visuality, the eclectic personal residues stuck inside the atmosphere of the home/gallery, builds upon these relational aesthetics. They create affects of inclusion, intimacy, and informal familiarity. That this atmosphere produces intimacy and inclusion by using personal belongings mirrors Sherman's method of constructing interpersonal closeness in her photo series, Renegades. In this shot of Fancy Art Show, we see ornaments and disco balls cluttering a mezzanine staircase. Leopard print articles drape across the banister. In Sherman's photo, Mesadina, there's a playfulness from the zebra-striped pants and the curtain made out of My Little Pony dolls. Campy and bold, these expressive interiors ironically signify the grave importance of remaining humorous. Relics such as these instill Fancy Art Show with vulnerability and intimacy, warmth and hospitality. This informal nature eases the process of bonding, inviting familiarity and lightheartedness. At each turn, we remember that real people live in the home/gallery experiment. Eclectic relics of expression, rice bags, disco balls, paper flowers exists separately from the art in the show. This unmanicured material stuff welcomes guests into both the home and the gallery. In using domestic residue to deliver a weight of intimacy in Fancy Art Show, Uzai Gallery harnesses tender human connection. These residues create similar weights of closeness in Sherman's portraits. In the series Renegades, Sherman both characterizes the subjects in her portraits and documents characters in a vulnerable, rebellious community forged in precarity and solidarity. With flash photos of nightlife, drag artists, gay picnics, and street culture, the series asserts a wildness, a colorful, makeshift dream of queer culture on a metropolitan stage. A culture that Sherman documents with deeply personal visual indicators of connection and relationships. Ula's room demonstrates how domestic stuff works dually, as characterization and as a visual gesture of intimacy. Ula, a recurring subject in Renegades, pulls on a pair of blue stockings surrounded by her trappings. Clothes across the floor, a collection of nail polish, and other traces of unedited life fall about her. Through these belongings and mediated by Sherman's eye, you and I access Ula's vibrance, her comfort, her mess, her mundane. Channeled through the camera, this feeling of comfort and safety in private space expresses tenderness among company, an aesthetic of belonging. This same intimacy, carefreeness, and closeness surfaced in Fancy Art Show. Amid water jugs and houseplants, we are welcomed into that which is personal, relational, and artistic. Obviously, Sherman and Uzai Gallery are not the only ones that rely on the domestic aspects of interiors. Sherman's contemporary, Catherine Opie, has a whole photo series called Domestic, and anyone surfing the internet circa 2010 can attest to the ubiquity of photos of rooms. I am especially interested in the way that both Sherman and Uzai Gallery apply the familiarization affects of interiors, because in both cases, these visual substances of familiarization harmonize with non-visual practices of space making or community building. In this twinned visual practical index, Fancy Art Show links arms with niche counterculture represented in Sherman's Renegades, thus entangling it with the history and identity of San Francisco. Liz Cahill, Uzai co-founder, designed the gallery as a net to celebrate the not quites, an effort in what she calls, quote, inclusive exclusivity. The gallery also provides financial and networking opportunities for local and visiting artists, developing a kind of counter-institution for off-kilter creators who lack formal art world clout. Inklings of this space-making work radiates throughout Renegades and ultimately links Fancy Art Show's social intentions with counterculture scenes in the city 3 decades ago. While Sherman's series Renegades illustrates Dyke counterculture in boldness, celebration, and tenderness, Sherman's subjects and community grappled with abjection and adversity. They ached from the grief of the AIDS crisis and yearned for a kind of home. In the photo series, Joy and Self-Determination visualize a community's praxis of collective empowerment, specifically the fruits/labors of uniting wayward alterns. To understand the gravity of San Franciscan counterculture in the 1990s, I turned to Rebecca Solnit's monograph, Hollow Cities, The Siege of San Francisco and the Crisis of American Urbanism. In Hollow Cities, Solnit offers a redefinition of bohemianism as the relationship between the urban relationship between the poor, the creative, and the subversive. This relationship, having wilted in the tech economies of San Francisco's 21st century, was instrumental as a metric of a heterogeneous, uncompromising, affordable city that prioritized cross-cultural relationships, authenticity, and opportunities for upward mobility. When I identify similarities in ethos and aesthetic between Sherman and Uzai, it is an interpretation of Fancy Art Show as an invitation not only into a home or a gallery, but to re-empower a San Franciscan bohemian counterculture and the social conditions this counterculture indicates. Hidden at the junction where the conversation on San Francisco's infamous gentrification meets the conversation on San Franciscan aesthetics of belonging lies the matter of heterogeneity. A city's economic accessibility means that people of color, artists, and grassroots activists with lower incomes can find cultural and social means of flourishing, and mind you, that might look quite different from conventional American indicators of success. Thriving intersectional bohemianism, such that we see in Sherman's Renegades, is an apt metric of heterogeneity, and certainly was in Solnit's observations of pre-Y2K San Francisco. Fallout from the 2000 dot-com boom in the city exaggerated class struggles and displacement that had simmered for decades prior. Economists and urban scholars remain fascinated with the conundrum of tech, money, and gentrification in 21st century San Francisco, finding a disparity of $300,000 in income between the top and bottom quintiles in San Francisco County. Subject to the feedback loop between capital, development, and displacement, we inched towards homogeneity, higher rent, greater wealth, more techies, more beige, making an altogether palatable, perhaps even respectable city. Then the COVID-19 quarantine affected San Francisco in unexpected ways. In 2020, rent in San Francisco plummeted 30%, opening an opportunity for lower income residents, artists among them, to gain foothold in the city. As quarantine restrictions began to lift, so many of us were overcome with the need for embodied local relationships, fatigued from our remote, over-digitalized social lives. These conditions primed the city for a metamorphosis where relational aesthetics and bohemianism can make a comeback in significant relevance. For Uzai Gallery is but one of so many underground DIY post-pandemic projects that organize for social and aesthetic purposes. San Franciscan aesthetics of belonging and fancy art show indicate certain motives behind the wider restless arts underground. It indicates frustration with the dominant sociocultural conditions, and it indicates a yearning for civic fellowship. As I contemplate Uzai Gallery's social and visual interventions in a wider spread attempt at challenging the regime of wealth and homogeneity, I remember that nostalgia is a passive experience. We can mythologize San Francisco's dynamic, heterogeneous, counterculture history as a past, bygone thing, recursively recycled. But today's creative underbelly actively invents its own avenues of rebellion, expression, community, and solidarity. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'm Sam Hiura, and this is Strange Silence, What Accumulates in Kenneth Tam's Sump. An adult son and his father stand with their shirtless backs turned towards the camera, pushing a mass of stacked furniture wrapped in plastic. The camera sits in darkness just outside of a door left slightly ajar. Every few seconds, the two push this heap of furniture together, the legs of a sofa chair scraping audibly on the floor, with their bare feet tapping against the ground with each step. Nothing is said, and the two remain in eye contact. Within their silence, their only point of connection is the movement of this weight. In Kenneth Tam's 2015 video work, Sump, questions of intimacy, silence, and tension are quietly prodded in the form of a loosely choreographed video performed by the artist and his father. For more than 7 minutes, the two engage silently in acts that waver between the mundane and the absurd, using the everyday objects that surround them in the basement that the pair inhabits. Within their unspoken interactions, Tam captures the intricate, complex dynamics of intimacy, demonstrating how interpersonal tensions become tangible and how they may become unsettled. I see Sump as an intervention employing a contentious coagulation of humor, silence, and bad feelings in their attachments, such as shame, guilt, silence, memory, and forgetting, as interdependent strategies employed to not only unsettle these bad feelings within Asian American social relationships, but also to forge complex visibility tactics within Asian American cultural representation. As I speak, I even find myself grappling with the anxiety that my own writing may contribute to a racialized oversimplification of Asian American experiences. I cannot deny the ways in which I imbue this work with the burden of unique, culturally situated interior experiences. While my identity as a Hapa or mixed race Okinawan Japanese American provides a subjective narrative of Asian American identity, it also situates me consistently at a point of blurriness, uncertainty, and flux. I write from the perspective that I am, in the words of scholar Kobina Mercer, quote, somewhere always already inside the text. I understand silence as both an after effect of generational trauma specific to Asians in America and a strategy creative actors utilize to undo its pervasiveness across all parts of daily life. To effectively use humor requires rhythm, and just as a good comedian leaves space between setup and punchline to allow the audience to settle in and push through to a deeper connection with the joke. Without moments of pause and suspension, you surrender knowing humor's deeper power to defang things. There must also be room for silence. My aim in writing and presenting with moments of intentional silence, like strategic withholdings of certain biographical or personal information of the artist and the object, is not to proliferate silence, but to experiment within its form alongside my subject. Our feelings weigh on us, and they shift, alter, and rupture our bodies and the ways in which we carry ourselves through the world. Through Sump, I ask, how may we materialize what accumulates within the dark, dingy hollows of our beings? And how do Asians unsettle the comfortable space that silence has promised through humor, everydayness, and silence itself? In Sump, the artist and his father, both shirtless and barefoot, perform a series of loosely choreographed and often absurd acts. Popping bubble wrap, blowing up balloons, gluing Cheerios to one another's faces, stationarily holding rolled up carpets. The only sound in the video comes from the ambient noise produced by their activities. Shuffling on the floor, the popping of plastic bubbles, or the monotonous whirring of a fan. Around a minute and a half into the video, Tam and his father stand facing one another under the steady stream of a shower head. In the shower, the two are enveloped in a dense, transparent plastic sheet, shielding them from the downpour of water. This arrangement amplifies the sound of the water, creating a stark contrast to the gentler sounds typically associated with water contacting skin, as droplets strike the plastic and are deflected. Their confined space within this cocoon compels the two men to occupy a physically intimate distance, rendering them close enough to embrace. However, they refrain from any intentional touch. This spatial closeness, while intimate, is made uncomfortable by their mutual refusal to acknowledge one another's presence. Their shirtlessness, partial nudity being inherently unusual and vulnerable, further thickens this tension between familiarizing forms of vulnerability and withholding. The artist protagonist Tam navigates the intricacies of interpersonal familiarity alongside a profound emotional and formal defamiliarization, creating a palpable sense of strangeness that, for me, embodies the underlying emotional discordance between him and his father. Humor also emerges, not from explicit punchlines or physical comedy, but rather from the absurdity of the pair's actions and the palpable awkwardness that accompanies them. Underneath the surface of Sump's humorous awkwardness, though, lies a nuanced yet tangible core of discomfort and pain. The interactions between Tam and his father are marked by a deliberate absence of closeness, as they refuse familial norms like eye contact or physical embrace, exaggerating the discomfort within the piece. I hadn't really encountered the word sump before Tam's video, and a quick Google search reveals two definitions. The first is a pit or hollow in which liquid collects, especially one in the floor of a mine or basement. This definition conjures a visceral mental image, especially compared to the latter, much drier definition. It, to me, carries a smell of dampness, coldly humid air, perhaps concrete worn by years of holding unmoved objects, much like the setting that Tam uses in Sump. In one moment, Tam cuts to a static shot from a low angle of a tight, narrow space with a cramped storage shelf to the left and a doorway to the right. The door slowly opens, and the two pairs of undressed legs cropped just above the knee enter, only to shuffle into a stationary position, intertwined as to suggest that the two unseen bodies are facing one another, too close for comfort, with their stances nearly enmeshed. Their bodies become unfamiliar as an effect of both Tam's cropping technique and the uncomfortably low and unconventional perspective. There is stillness in these static and near-static shots, where artifacts of life such as cleaning supplies, disused grocery bags, and boxes have visibly accumulated around Tam and his father. The accumulation of these objects symbolically evokes the heaviness of the space that they share. The uncanny space of the basement also reminds me of how the objects we store in there are often conditional, items we don't need on a regular basis but might require someday, potentially things we avoid. Despite how we may try to ignore these things, they persist, dusty and hidden but still present. Tam puts us in uncomfortable visual proximity to these stowed everyday things, reminding us of what we may have tucked away in our basements. Sitting silently with them in this cramped space makes me feel as uncomfortable as their shuffling feet attempting to find a comfortable position among the clutter. Perhaps Tam's use of silence in Sump can be interpreted as an attempt to subdue the discomfort of the fraught space that he and his father cannot help but represent in their shared strangeness and estrangement. In the nearly 8-minute video, the pair hold eye contact only once, just after the 6-minute mark. Their lack of eye contact throughout, in conjunction with some of Sump's more physically intimate interactions, makes for an uncomfortable viewing experience, allowing the video to become a container for the tense space between them, buzzing with what goes unsaid. As Tam captures, if things are not spoken aloud, they cannot materialize, and instead accumulate in the sumps of our beings. If things do not materialize, we do not risk becoming stuck in their viscosity. Bad feelings become weighty and material or sticky, able to build up, jam, and catch other feelings within them. It becomes simply easier and cleaner to maintain the sterile promise of silence. Through Tam's lens, the sticky, unkept nature of intimate relationships are reproduced for the public eye. Otherwise mundane familial expressions of intimacy are exaggerated, made uncanny, and transmuted into something familiar but altogether unusual. Understanding that these are choreographed interactions between the artist and his father, I am drawn to imagine the lived experience of creating this video. Perhaps Tam's father's willingness to participate in Sump is itself an act of complex yet tangible love. At the same time, the uncomfortability of these acts represents Tam's interest in seeing just how deeply his father's love runs. Perhaps Sump, on both parts, is simply an enactment of an unspoken desire to spend time with one another. Here, humor and participation within performance carves out a safe space for engaging with the discomforting confluence of love and bad feelings. On the surface, humor in Sump opens the basement door to what's stickier, damper. Sump is imbued with both a real expression of bad feelings as well as softness, where expressions of care remain symbolically quiet and often elusive. Bad feelings are not conjured in vain, but rather for the hope of something different or new. We may enter Sump through a sense of humor, but find ourselves becoming caught in its more profound, less palatable themes. I cannot rest my argument solely within the binary of hurting and healing because, as demonstrated by Tam, there's rich generative complexity in bad feelings. By employing humor and strangeness as invitations to sit with what is uncomfortable, Sump exposes the value of reaching into the stickiness of these feelings. And through silence, Tam offers the reflective space necessary to stay with them. Eventually, we may heal, but first, we must allow ourselves to get stuck in the sumps of our beings, where we may begin to shift the silence. Thank you.
All right, so first of all, let's give our panelists a warm round of applause. So thank you, Sloane, Giorgie, Sam, for those magnificent presentations. We have 15 minutes to talk about them, to discuss all of the wonderful, intense, and complex ideas that you've offered us. I can start with some questions. So, today's panel indicates the subjects of human bodies, places, and families. Could each of you give us your take on these key words in your research? So, bodies, places, and families.
Hi, thank you all, and hi, my name is Giorgie. Yeah, I can start with places. My inspiration for the way that I think about places doesn't come from like a critical framework. It's sort of like a methodology that I borrow from like fiction and genres of literature, specifically horror. I was compelled to rethink my relationship with places while I was reading the book House of Leaves, and then further inspired to think about like the agency of locations, contemplating The Haunting of Hill House, and initially imagining places as things that can hate, and then extending that to just like places as things that can feel and have attitudes towards people in general, and that there is a relationship between like how like for expanding that bigger out of the genre, for like what we as people give to place, and like how do we like create an architecture that then like gives to generations beyond the ones that built the architecture. So those kind of personifications of place were really important to the way that I was thinking about specifically San Francisco kind of as like a beating, living place. And truly a character and an identity that gives to the people that live in it, and then also you know, is taken from and is transformed and doesn't always necessarily have its own agency as well.
Sure, yeah, I can talk about, I'm specifically thinking about bodies, sort of obviously, it's like so much of what the presentation is about. So Judith Butler, I'm sorry, this is gonna get a little annoying for a second. Judith Butler's second book is called Bodies That Matter, which is their follow-up to Gender Trouble. And I believe in Bodies That Matter, not in Gender Trouble, they have this kind of extended segment where they talk about Pérez's burning. Specifically this one scene in Pérez's burning where this young trans woman, Venus Extravaganza, is talking about how after she gets bottom surgery that she'll be able to get like a nice house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and a washing machine. And Butler is like very, very critical of this desire and sort of links her desire to have surgery with her desire for like a sort of normalcy. And I remember reading this like, I think maybe like the month that I started hormones and being like, well, that feels a little fucked up. Just that, how is Butler going to lay the blame at this one person's feet when like this is the kind of social modeling that we've all been taught to understand and incorporate and internalize for so much of our lives? Like, how is Butler going to analyze this one person's body and the decisions that she wants to make with her body and say that like that uniquely is a problem as opposed to like the structures of medicine and whiteness which lead us to desire certain things. So that's kind of like how this project started. I also talk a lot about place in like the full thesis version of this work, like specifically like my location in the San Francisco Bay Area, the embedded histories of like queerness and transness that are here. But just did not really have time and space to get into it in this presentation. But if you want to talk more about that, I'd be happy to chat about that at some point.
Thank you, Jasmin, for your question. I think that what has been more important to me than family in my work with this piece is bodies. Family, it serves as like kind of the foundational context in this piece, because I think that our primary experience in forming interpersonal and social bonds is like starts in the family unit. But I think what I'm interested more in is how accessing and like visualizing these material forms or material treatments to feelings, especially like negative feelings in interpersonal relationships, has like larger resonance in broader interpersonal and social relationships within Asian American communities and beyond. So while family to me feels like obviously a very obvious object and focus in the work that I'm looking at, I think that more broadly the material treatment of what happens between bodies is more significant to my research. And I mean, yeah, I think like when you watch the video in full, it's pretty thick with tension in a way that I think is really hard to capture, which is a really incredible piece of the work. I hope that you're able to get a little bit of a glimpse of that, but yeah, so I think bodies and kind of the material treatment of feelings is definitely the bigger focus of my work.
We will have time for questions, I promise. Just one more. which is actually, it dovetails with what Sam was just talking about. Though the research projects are so different, they are all circling the question of relationships. So Sam started talking about the role of family, the limits of that as a framework for understanding the artwork that she was exploring through her project. What though could the other two of you give us to understand about the relationships, either social, artistic, familial? How can we understand these relationships differently through your research? Maybe there are other relationships that I'm not even thinking of or articulating, but how do your projects touch upon relationships?
So, hey Marlene, is it okay if I embarrass you really quickly?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that lady, in 2020, picked me up at like, I don't know, 4 or 5 in the morning and drove me to San Leandro, like drove me to go get out with us. And, you know, took care of me and was there for me. And the day before I was supposed to get this surgery, I had a very close friend of mine effectively say, who was supposed to be like my point person, basically, like, I'm gonna be there for you, I'm gonna take a week off of work, back out at the last minute. And I had a couple friends who are now much, much, much closer friends say that, like, I can step up and I can be there for you and I can take care of you. And there is an incredible importance for me in how, what I would hope at least, is that like these networks of care can like construct my understanding of myself. That like I did not really think about who I was and how I was operating in the world until I moved here and was like so intertwined with communities of care and communities of belonging, specifically around other trans people. And it just has really transformed my life. And I think like we could get very abstract about like, you know, my blonde hair means like certain things in different contexts, or like my whiteness means certain things in different contexts. But I do think that like when we get down to like how do communities impact the way we understand ourselves and the ways that we are able to take care of ourselves and love one another, that I think is ideally what I would like my work to be asking, and it's like a question that I want to continue to ask as I like expand out this project.
Thanks for sharing that, Sloane. I almost cried. And thanks for your questions, Jasmin. Relationships in my project operate on a lot of different levels. Like I was trying to think about it really not impersonal, conceptual ways, like the micro-social, or the like of like these like niche art scenes, or like queer counterculture, or like the metro-social in terms of like how do we reconcile with the richest people in our state and country living with the most economically disenfranchised people in our state and country, and just like within like blocks of each other, in terms of like space. If we're going back to like place, like we turn a corner in San Francisco and it's like, whoa, we went from like high rise to like basement, like it's really drastic. And I think that for me on like a theoretical level, the relational aesthetics that I speak to, more so in my thesis, I can really get into them because they're not so visual. They're ethereal, immaterial things, you know. But they do kind of set the stage in this project and in these artworks for creating a focus on how people like relate to one another. It situates audiences to pay attention, I think. At least to start the conversation in their head about how we're thinking about how we relate to each other internally, or on the civic level as well. And I think that's about it.
I kind of lied. There's one more question, but it is, do you have questions of each other? They have no questions of each other. All right. your questions. I saw some eager hands up there. Trisha Lowe.
Hi. Thank you guys for your incredibly lucid presentations. I really appreciated the sort of like concision and style of them in particular. Actually, your answers just now kind of emphasize something that I noticed about all three of your presentations, which is that you're speaking about artworks that sort of like exist at the threshold of belonging, right? And at those thresholds of belonging, what's produced is this kind of like sense of like a fiction or fantasy, like excessive fiction or excessive fantasy, right? In Giorgie's presentation, this sort of like nostalgia for Bohemia, or in Sloane's presentation, this sense in which like a scar grows in excess of a wound, right? Or its relationship to like white fantasy of white femininity, right? And then I think in Sam's presentation, this sense in which like that threshold crossing into family or masculinity and like the inability of those things to be articulated produces these sort of like very, very strange and uncanny images of intimacy, right? But I'm very curious because these are still fictions, right? They're not necessarily reality. So I'm wondering how you view fiction in the context of your project or these artworks, whether they are sites of critique or possibility or even of complicity, right? Like what is the function of the fiction in these projects?
I can try. Did you hear mostly?
Sorry, it was a long question.
And I don't know if I can give it, summarize it all that well, but Trisha asks about the role of fiction, that these frameworks of masculinity, femininity, nostalgia are fictions of a kind, and whether our panelists see that as sites of possibility, critique. What is the role of fiction?
Thank you, Trisha. That was a really amazing question. I think I'll make this brief. In my larger thesis, I also look at a scene in the film Everything Everywhere All at Once. So in that regard, I was thinking about fiction really strongly. And not only fiction, but humor and absurdist humor, and how humor allows us to kind of play and imagine otherwise. Whether utopically or dystopically. And so I think, but in the same vein, humor still, in Tam's work too, functions the same way as a place to prod and explore and kind of be in this interstitial space between what's there, what's kind of real, quote unquote, and what's not real, or what could be, or what might be, or what could have been. And I think that what kind of combined with silence, there's this invitation to imagine those things and to really immerse in the fiction and think about alongside him in the work what those fictions could look like. I think that that's a really great way of kind of reframing the core of my work.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot about the role of fantasy and fiction, specifically what it offers for queer and trans people. And that's one of the reasons that I came to this school, because it offered this dual degree program where I could also go get an MFA in creative writing. The section of Brathwaite Shirley's work that I talked about is a very, very small sliver of it. And there is a nightclub that you can go to and navigate through that space and encounter what it is to ask somebody to dance with you and getting consent for that. And I think the thing that's very interesting for me about the experience of playing through that game and you can make different choices and have different outcomes is that it's so excessive and kind of dramatic and almost campy to this point that it forces you to think about and reflect back on your own much smaller versions of that response. So I think about my own experiences in a nightclub. The thing that actually brings you to the city is that you're supposed to move there with a friend, and that person has died. And you get to the city and you get a voicemail from this person, and it's the last thing you hear from that person. And so at the very beginning of this experience, I'm thinking about a very close trans friend of mine who died, who I met like right when I moved here. And I think about how these experiences of showing off the kind of like most dramatic excesses of life that are found in fantasy and fiction can force us to encounter like the much smaller, much more granular parts of the real that are found within all of our lives.
Thanks, Sloane. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jasmin. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Trisha, for posing this question. I'll try to keep it brief. When I think about fantasy within the context of bohemia and nostalgia, I really love that you brought up complacency. I think that I'm definitely like complacent in, you know, the nostalgification of San Francisco, and I think that part of this thesis was challenging myself to not look retrospectively, but look like prospectively, and look like see that there are immediate community members and there's immediate action, and not just the art scene, but in other networks that are very clear and here. I also kind of want to revisit the topic of family, because I don't think I got to talk about it, and I did feel like I depersonalized my own connection to this project. I was born here. I have a ton of like non-blood aunties that raised me here, and I was around like doulas all my life, and like my dad gets to tell me stories of how like he used to skate down by Civic Center before there was a skate park there, and like these are this is the, you know, it's fictionalized, but they're also it was one part, like the nostalgia for bohemianism is one part things I was brought up in before I could have the agency to be cool or hip because I was 6, or things that I was told in terms of like what my weird, crazy parents were up to, like having the time of their lives, like living in this like very sensationalized past, where I don't really get to experience all of the drawbacks, complications, or problems that came with 1990 San Francisco.
Yes.
Hi there. I have a question for all 3 of you. I was wondering if you would be able to share a section or argument that you had to leave out of your presentation since you had like this limited time frame. Yeah, I'd love to hear more.
So will they share some part that they had to excise from their projects?
So I had a whole second art object that I was trying to fit in and talk about, which is the musician and producer Sophie. And the first music video that she came out with after she came out as trans is called It's Okay to Cry. And in that music video, she has these really dramatic cheek prosthetics that like extend almost like 2 inches off of her face. And from certain angles, it doesn't look like she's wearing them, and from certain angles, they, like it's so dramatic as to be like almost like a caricature of like what a person's face is supposed to look like who undergoes cosmetic surgery. And I really wanted to include an analysis of that music video alongside my experiences going to like taking various friends to and from this like incredibly expensive private FFS clinic in Union Square, basically. It's like a block from, or next door to Tiffany. And the cost, like this person doesn't take insurance, the cost of most surgeries are anywhere from like $50,000 to $100,000 for people. And trying to analyze like how we think about, you know, bodies as sites of consumption and visualize certain bodies as excessive or, you know, like overindulgent almost, sort of relating back to this idea of like how fantasy and fiction as like dramatic excess can actually like lead us to places of like interesting critique.
Hi, Paulina. That's a question from a real alumni of the I think, there's a lot of stuff. I think one thing that is that doesn't translate from my work, from the written work into the presentation, is the use of footnotes. footnotes, and I think for like almost all of us in this project have been really significant as different kind of interventions in the text. But a larger piece that I had to leave out that was like really painful to leave out was, which I kind of mentioned at the top of how sump kind of creates this like expansive and more complex representation of Asian Americans. And how I think that functions is the tension between public versus private performance and availability of this work. This is an exhibition, this is a video work made for exhibition display. I got to curate it in my curatorial practice thesis exhibition last year at the Wattis. Kind of like really large scale projections so that it kind of doubles that uncomfortable closeness with the work. And so they're kind of slightly larger than life size. And I think the way that this work lives in exhibition space versus also being like publicly available online, like on his website or on Vimeo or YouTube or whatever, creates this like an even more exaggerated tension with the kind of intimacy and vulnerability that's being represented in the video. And that's kind of to say that's the element of the work that's creating a more complex and uncomfortable representational experience of Asian Americanness and Asian American masculinity in particular. Which I did include in my Silence essay, which, those will be published imminently, publicly.
Thank you, Paulina. Really great question for a panel. I would have loved if I had 10 extra minutes to nerd out about something that really doesn't necessarily support my argument, which is a comparative analysis between the relational aesthetics in Fancy Art Show as a DIY underground project versus the relational aesthetics in, oh man, I did so much. It was at the De Young, Li Mingwei's project at the De Young last summer, and the differences that we can explore in terms of what relational aesthetics still or does not have to offer us in the 21st century at the institutional level or at the DIY intimate level. Could talk about that, but I won't.
Okay, so we are at the end of our time and we'll resume shortly. Thank you.
Good afternoon now, everybody. I'm Jackie Francis, and I'm going to be the moderator for panel 2. The title of panel 2 is The Pull of History, The Shape of Sovereignty. And our panelists are Yunfei and Vanessa Pérez Winder. Their full biographies are in the printed programs. I'll just give you a short preview of their presentations and short introductions to who they are. So Yunfei is an art critic, a multidisciplinary artist and researcher whose practice focuses on subcultural and marginalized communities and their cultural creations. She is also working on a socially engaged art project appropriating abandoned newspaper boxes to raise awareness about non-alien residency. She is an MA candidate in VCS. The title of her paper is Unwilling Equilibrium, a study of Chinese fan art of Disco Elysium. Vanessa Pérez Winder is a Peruvian-American writer, editor, and arts worker, committed to liberatory and decolonial forms of research, theory, and curatorial praxis. Their writing has appeared in Variable West, Interventions, and the exhibition catalog Reunited. She is an MA candidate in VCS. The title of her paper is Sickness, Sovereignty, and Sodomite Symbolism, Javi Vargas's Taqui, Onqoy, Chuquichinchay, y la mala muerte. So let's have Yunfei start us off with panel 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Hi. Thank you all for being here. Today I'm going to talk about Disco Elysium and its Chinese fandom. Disco Elysium is an award-winning role-playing indie game developed by Estonian game studio Bello in 2019. It is a rather elitist game that overwhelms its player with obscure poetic lines instead of traditional combat system in this genre, appealing to a philosophically inclined group of players who are often also plagued by their excessive empathy and sensitivity. Due to its success in China, caused by the intentional choice of simplified Chinese as the first supported foreign language, Chinese fans have created enormous amount of fan art based on this game. Their fan creations often depict the difficult choice between struggling and submitting to protect something more important. In this presentation, I'm going to share 2 pieces of fan art created by Chinese fans, an illustration showing an internalization of propaganda, and a comic reflecting our revolution. In Disco Elysium, the player assumes the role of a police officer named Hiura, who lost his memory and finds he had to solve a murder case in Rivershore, a city trying to recover from a failed attempt to build a communist republic, which left the city under the foreign military occupation with severe economic recession. Disco Elysium allows players to explore their political preferences to reshape the city, including communism, ultraliberalism, moralism, which is centrism in the game, and fascism. Unlike most Disco Elysium fan art from the English-speaking world, which tend to focus on the psychological mechanism design of the protagonist's amnesia or the dilemma of the declining city, Chinese fan art resonates more with the critical topics that the game evokes. Picking up on the game's pro-communist themes, Chinese fan artists are drawn to the choice players had to make among the 4 ideologies and the implication of an impending revolution in the game's marginalized narrative, and also the game's rare citation of Marxist theories. It is rare in China because China is now a political vacuum with complex invisible taboos. The harsh reality makes even the subtle and conservative expressions they made in fan art groundbreakingly great. In the original game, Hiura joins a secret reading club and practices communist theory by debating and building towers with matchbox with several fanciful college students who are communists. Finally, they built the tower successfully, and the tower turned out to be the monument to the Third International by Vladimir Taqi. The tower was designed at the headquarters of the Soviet Union, using steel and glass to create a transparent government building that is completely open and supervised by the public. In the fan illustration created by fan artist Tang Man named Another World, the protagonist Harrier and his newly assigned partner Lieutenant King Kisalagi are standing in a valley with a winding road paved by red flags, looking at a skyscraper located on the distant hill at the end of the road. The building is modern and flashy, at odds with the valley in which it sits. The change from an open spiral tower representing the purest idea of communism to the authoritative building implies a transition from utopia to dystopia, and the shift from a dark indoor space to an imaginary bright outdoor area highlights the delusion of illusory promises. The answer that the game gives is obviously no, yet the answer to a similar question posed by a Chinese fan in response to a fan comic named "And This Is the Way the World Ends" is not that clear. Should you voluntarily extinguish anger when you know it is pointless and even invite the destruction of yourself and the things you love? The comic is collaboratively created by two Chinese fan artists, Abla and Mingwish. It is a fan-made sequel after one of the endings of Elysium, in which Harrier failed to solve the case or to stay sober, thus being left behind by his colleagues and become a homeless man, wandering and spreading doomsday theory that a revolution is about to take place, followed by war, and a nuclear bomb is going to end every single life in this area. In the fan comic, Harriet gets into the illusory world and sees all the multiversal possibilities of the destruction of the city. The only way he finds to save lives is to put the world into the illusion, where he can hold the bomb in midair and keep all residents in a painless dream, yet the solution is strongly proposed by his partners. King chose to invest in the future and devote himself to the revolution, even though his own prophesied death. In this scene, he willingly accepts his death after experiencing the cruelty behind the glorified concept of revolution, the suffering of revolutionaries and civilians. The two adjacent pages are depicted in very different styles, highlighting the cleanness and brightness of the illusory world, making it a peaceful era to which everyone wants to return. However, when they drive away to enjoy their timeless afterlife in the illusion at the end of the comic, they know clearly that they are under the literal threat of a nuclear bomb. Harriet's former partner, Kumar, chose to fight as well, not for justice or victory, but to reunite with people he cares about. Knowing that the failure and death are unavoidable, James considers his own death as a reunion and tries to survive longer to let Harriet come back to us, rather than to follow Harriet to another world. It is a subtle thought with a mild complaint for a comrade who left before him in the desperate atmosphere of the later stage of revolution. And This Is the Way the World Ends clearly takes an anti-war stance and values things and people one encounter in their life over big concept, yet doesn't give a solution. It is a story about someone who falls in love with the world so easily, but the world doesn't always deserve it. Chinese fan artists like Abla and Mingwish are usually online activists as well, who invest in social justice, raising awareness with both their fan art and textual expression. Yet the marginalized experience they have in both political and virtual life makes them really feel qualified to change the reality to any extent. It is love that makes people weak and conservative in their political stances, make readers bounded by their attachment to the work, and make fans work voluntarily in fandoms. Through these works, I admire the ambiguity they revealed, like the undefined love among the characters, like the flaw in Salum Studio's kindness to China and communism, like a hidden anger that the fan artists have towards themselves, that they hate their ability to love. By creating fan art for Elysium, Chinese fan artists pay tribute to the game and its creators, and responds to their experience with the meta text they create around the game. They show a veiled political view in their work and unwilling equilibrium after winning all the options, under the double cover of visual and critical and fictional work based on a game with cautious bravery. Thank you.
In the decades following the 1532 arrival of Spanish colonizers in the Peruvian Andes, a little-known anti-colonial resistance and spiritual revival movement known as Taqui Onqoy began to take root. Translating directly from Quechua as something between dancing sickness and sickness of the chant, Taqui Onqoy described the indigenous belief that the spirits of the Andean world, enraged about the imposition of Christianity, were now possessing the bodies of their people to deliriously perform traditional songs, dance, and rituals in a desperate and frenzied attempt to restore the world as it once was. Violently suppressed by Spanish authorities, the infectious movement left behind little tangible evidence, with scholars having long debated the factual existence of Taqui Onqoy, its causes, and both perceived and imagined level of threat to the power of the Spanish crown. Some have more recently argued that it may have been the physical manifestation of, quote, the largest epidemic of mercury poisoning known to humanity, a consequence of extractivist mining and forced labor practices during the early colonial era. Embracing a potential for multiple and intersecting truths, contemporary Peruvian artist Javi Vargas harnesses this ambiguous history in his picto sculpture, Taqui Onqoy, Chuquichinchay y la Mala Muerte, from 2021. Mobilizing erotic and cultural histories native to the region, Vargas reanimates the insurgent spirit of Taqui Onqoy as a spectral, mutable force that continues to haunt the present moment, and also summons the image and constellation of the androgen Incan feline deity Chuquichinchay, who is inscribed in history as protector of the dual-gendered Indians. Using an encoded and poetic language, Vargas presents a multi-scene visual narrative that points to the entanglement between contemporary ecological crisis, the racialized, gendered, and sexual politics of viral infection, contamination, and death, and sacred cosmologies and ways of knowing, which live primarily outside of the confines of Western knowledge production. As I bear witness to injustice and mass death across the globe, always experienced first by indigenous and other colonized peoples, alongside attacks on queer and trans communities of color by right-wing governments in both Peru and the United States, I have found myself turning to Vargas' practice for guidance often, due to the way he stretches the boundaries of what is true and what might be in a decolonized future. Taqui Onqoy Chuquichinchay la Mala Muerte takes on the form of a large wooden chacana, or Andean cross. One of the oldest and most ubiquitous symbols in Andean visual culture, the chacana is steeped in layers of deep cosmological significance, with its geometric and axial precisions mirroring conceptions of balance and duality within nature. Meanwhile, its triple-stepped form corresponds to the equilibrium between the underworld, the present world, and the higher world, with the circle at the center symbolizing the cosmic intersection of these realms. Vargas' formal decision to structure this work around the chacana serves a symbolic purpose, directly informing how his fragmented narrative unfolds. In the work's higher realm, Vargas uses the stars in the sky as a memorial space for gender nonconforming figures in Peruvian history. He pays homage to his peer and friend, the late performance artist and theorist Giuseppe Campuzano, who continued her own museo archival project and Museo Travesti del Perú, or the Transvestite Museum of Peru, from 2003 until her death from AIDS-related complications in 2013. Campuzano's years-long philosophical exploration of the travesti body as an embodied methodology for interrogating colonial temporalities and resisting archival erasure has provided an influential framework for much of Vargas' visual language, as well as my own writing and research over the years. While a combined need for global recognition, support, and rejecting stigma has pushed some in Peru to adopt a trans identity, as fellow scholar Malu Machuca Rose clarifies in reference to Campuzano's work, travesti is not woman and is not trans. Travesti is classed and raced. It means you do not present femininely all the time because you cannot afford to. Travesti is the refusal to be trans, the refusal to be woman, the refusal to be intelligible. Most importantly, she has always been here. Alongside, Vargas also includes the names of popular drag entertainers, as well as Francisco Pro, an Afro-Indigenous tailor who, according to colonial documents, was arrested under the Viceroyalty's earliest anti-sodomy laws. Placing these names as part of a celestial and divine order, Vargas reclaims a level of sacredness and protection for those whose bodies have been inscribed within colonial history as deviant and immoral. Vargas's camp and travesti reimagining of the Inca-descended 18th century militant revolutionary leader Tupac Amaru II stands out as the most politically controversial element of the work and Vargas's broader practice. Referred to by the artists as las tupis, these figures appear repeatedly as hybrid creatures. Subverting the canonization of Tupac Amaru's image and its past violent use by the nationalist and masculine left in Peru, Vargas's tupis attempt to dissolve the false dichotomy and antagonism that has been established between the body of the proletariat or militant and that of a queer, queen, or sex worker, revealing the dearth of imagination that still precludes our collective liberation. In the middle step, Vargas focuses on the terrain of the living, layering contemporary struggles with past violences enacted by the imperial state. Throughout, Vargas invokes 17th and 18th century hybrid Baroque aesthetics, synthesizing imperial and religious motifs with sacred and profane symbolism deriving from the Inca and pre-Inca past. Extending this tradition, his drawings carry an element of sadomasochist satire, creating abject, perverse inversions as a means of undermining colonialism's epistemological authority. In the very center of the chacana, a brazen, seductive tupi sits on all fours connected to a medical oxygen cylinder, red marks covering her exposed, raised ass cheeks. Bird-like figures with instruments surround her. Possessed by the boisterous spirit of Taqui Onqoy, they appear suspended somewhere between ritual and rebellion. To the right, two figures are pictured near the mouth of a coal mine as flames engulf a ravaged landscape, linking the still ongoing mining industry to environmental collapse and human suffering. An eerie reflection of the forest fires which have steadily been increasing across the Peruvian Amazon. An armed and winged tupi looks over the scene, appearing as both a protective and avenging spirit. Both aesthetically and conceptually, Vargas consciously situates himself within a transtemporal genealogy of anti-colonial resistance in the Andes. On one hand, he draws from pictorial strategies and erotic practices dating back to antiquity. On the other, he works knowingly within an aesthetic genealogy pioneered by artists beginning in the 1980s. This formed during a period of intense political violence, social repression, and mass death and disappearance that characterized the Peruvian internal armed conflict of 1980 to 2000, alongside the onset of the global HIV/AIDS pandemic, conditions under which Vargas, who was born in 1972, came of age. In light of still fully unearthed conflict histories and the persecution of queer and indigenous subjectivities within the state's official archives, most of the existing academic scholarship around queer and sexually dissonant art has importantly focused on this period and its immediate post-conflict aftermath. But in seeking to more clearly illustrate these transtemporal political threads that I have long been thinking about, feeling, and observing, in order to convey a sense of collective urgency and follow recent but scarce attempts in the North American Academy to privilege a distinctly Andean mode of thought, my understanding of Vargas's work has become informed by the writings of Bolivian subaltern theorist and activist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who theorizes liberation as rooted in the Andean worldview of reciprocal and harmonious relationship to the land, the cosmos, our fellow species, and to each other. In particular, Cusicanqui's explanation of the Andean conception of time as antilinear, unfolding in repetitive spirals of generation that always return to the same point, provides a critical lens for understanding Vargas's resurrection of symbols at this particular moment in history. As Cusicanqui posits, there is evidence of physical, spiritual, and intellectual links between anti-colonial struggles dating back to 1532 to contemporary acts of protest in the region. And at their core, they all share a fundamental modernizing struggle for self-determination and the prospect of shared civility. These acts, which I would define and extend to as being our artworks, poems, songs, dances, deepest desires, dirtiest erotic encounters, labor and agrarian strikes, road blockages, and prison riots, evoke an aversion of historical time, the insurgency of a past and future which may culminate in renewal or catastrophe. Vargas leverages this potential, offering an entry point into a lexicon of insurrection that has yet to be fully realized. In arranging a jam-packed multitude of historical references across time, Vargas draws significant connections between sickness, animalities, and sexuality. Notably, this work was produced in 2021, both the year of Peru's bicentennial anniversary and also the year it became the country with the highest COVID death toll per capita in the world. A year after this work was made, in 2022, Peru also began seeing the mass die-off of marine birds from H5N1. In the Andean worldview, birds act specifically as intermediaries with the divine, making Vargas's bird figures a potent reimagining of interspecies relationships severed under the colonial capitalist biopolitical order. Of course, we know that viral events can emerge from zoonotic transmission, more generally connected to broader patterns of environmental devastation and capitalist exploitation. Equally, COVID, described by the writer Zoe Zamutzi as a pandemic of Western movement, has most recently underscored how mobility, consumption, and contemporary demands for eco, ethno, and even sexual tourism also create conditions for viral spread, not unlike the disease spread by European colonizers hundreds of years ago. Moreover, the prevalence of Peru's now centuries-long mining industry, alluded to in Taqui Onqoy, has also been named responsible for the contamination of water and soil on indigenous lands that cause severe health issues in the local population. Aside from a literal understanding of sickness, I'm also thinking through the pathologization of queerness and political dissent. The word sick or enfermo is often used to discipline bodies that refuse conformity. This kind of prejudice is embedded in larger systems of politics and healthcare that render queerness and transness into pathological states, the illnesses which actually need to be corrected or eradicated. Where do we locate sovereignty within a framework that commodifies bodies, identities, and land? If sickness, unjust death, and ecocide are the defining conditions of the present, how are we to theorize the futures we deserve? Vargas, and his invitation to inhabit a world of inverses and opposites together, makes a compelling argument for relating to struggle on the basis of our shared infection, impurity, and fugitivity. If it is true that some of our ancestors, in their delirium, their bodies ravaged by the dancing sickness, were able to see a future vision of reconstitution and collective healing, then perhaps we can also continue their madness. Amidst recent conditions of increasing state repression and censorship, mirroring that of the former armed conflict, Vargas has retained his work's revolutionary ethos by publicly participating in Peru's recent movements and strikes, including against the contested right-wing government of unelected President Dina Boluarte, and in solidarity with the global struggle for Palestinian liberation. As history and recent events have demonstrated, in times of major upheaval, dissident subjectivities often become the first targets of reactionary forces in pursuit of maintaining national order and ideological purity. In contrast, as Chuquichinchay warns, in the most liberal of circumstances, the forces of empire can theatricalize our struggle, rendering us politically inert. Vargas devours both of these realities, breathing life into futures and solidarities that can never be quite fully subsumed by the violence of the state nor the logic of capital. As these logics continue to follow in crisis, rejected by the masses, Vargas shows us a glimpse of how we might go about conjuring a new set of relations that cannot be co-opted, destroyed, or divorced from our political realities and imaginations.
So thank you for these splendid papers in panel 2. Take 10 minutes or so to field some questions and think about some conversation. So I can start off with one. So the panel title, The Pull of History and the Shape of Sovereignty, is inspired by your research into national and cultural histories and your analyses of power. Creative power meets sovereign power meets national power. So I want to ask both of you, what draws you to the study of history? what draws you to analyze individual creative power, whether it's the fan who does fan art or the artist like Javi Vargas?
Thank you for the question, Jackie. Did you know a singer who said, "I'm your favorite artist, your favorite artist"? And I feel like I'm the fan of fans. Because I really love how they like put their love in fiction things and feel real joy and sorrow and suffer from that. And I am part of them, so I feel I have to write something about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jackie. I think for me, I've been really interested in Peruvian history. I didn't grow up being able to go to Peru, and then that was something that happened later in my adult life. So I think that for me also, it's an intervention in thinking about kind of intellectual and artistic contributions from the global South. I think kind of my academic experience, just in all spaces in general, has been that, sometimes people ignore political or epistemological concepts from Latin America. This was important for me to do. And then also just in terms of linking queer liberation and ecological land sovereignty, I think that, I don't know if in the United States we immediately think of queer liberation and environment immediately linked together, but as I hope my presentation showed that they are inextricably linked.
Great. Thank you both. My second question, and then I'll open it up, is both of you study cultural phenomena that require attention, because and your attention becomes almost immersive. I'm just thinking about the fans' ability to follow a role-playing game full of plot twists and turns, which is key to their own creations. And then I'm thinking about Vargas's installation, which is this dense panorama of captured moments, scenes, actions that really unfold at the viewer's eye level. Would each of you talk about the researcher's attention to detail, and even how many hours do you think you've spent thinking about your projects?
I think for me, it's like you mentioned, there's so many images and tiny little symbols in this work, but I didn't notice that the top virgin little symbol has a penis sticking out of the cloak until a couple months ago, I think. But I definitely, I think for me, it was definitely a didactic tool in having to decode all of these symbols. Some symbols I just recognized culturally, but I didn't know what Taqui Onqoy was, and so each little quadrant and thing just led to another kind of deep investigation. So many hours, and then also just it really, the thesis kind of just taught me to look at a single work for just so long in a way that I don't usually stay with artworks just in general, so yeah.
I think I put 80 hours in the game playing. And after that, I was dive into the sea of internet to see all the fan creation. And the thing really inspired me to write this paper is in the official translation. As I mentioned, Simplified Chinese is the first spotted foreign language in this game. And in the official translation, they translate the word communism into another word. It's a creative word. It's not the word we usually use to say communist. So but the game is not censored. It's put on Steam, which is a platform not be censored. But they still want to do this to avoid some potential trouble. So it really makes me think why they want to do that, and why they feel troubled when they have the choice to use the original word communism. And this game is also a very rare chance for me to see all the ideology names written not in a textbook. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. I want to open it up to questions. I have others, but I want to open it up to questions and comments. I'm going to pass the mic around this time.
Hi, my question is about the second art object in Miss Faye's work, the comic that's called This Is the Way the World Ends, which is, I'm pretty sure, a reference to the T.S. Eliot poem, and at the end it's, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Obviously the bang in the comic is the giant bomb, but I was wondering what you think the whimper is.
Wow, I haven't think about that. Yeah, I guess it's the different understanding of their written future from the three of the characters. Like they have different, they do different things, they make different choices, but they're working to the same end. I think but thank you for that. I will try to think about that in this way. Thank you.
Vanessa, I was wondering if you spent any time thinking about the ghost dance movement here in the U.S., which shares a lot of similarities to Taqui Onqoy, in terms of this dance that was happening in resistance to the strong arming of Native Americans into the reservation system and whatnot. But so that's one part, and then secondarily, I wonder if you could maybe both speak to another question that came up, which was when you were talking about how the Peruvian left sort of has an aversive reaction to the queering of Tupac Amaru. I wonder, it pointed to this idea that like a strong and hopefully liberatory political structure has the capacity to house many different kinds of imaginaries. We know that American liberalism is also deeply capable of that, and I just wonder if you could speak to maybe what the distinction is between maybe a liberatory subsuming versus this liberal subsuming that we all know is highly prevalent in America. So thanks for both.
Thanks, Jorge, for your questions. On the first question, no, I hadn't, to be honest, this thesis research was so tunnel, insular into this Peruvian, Andean context. I definitely think about how to, and it's something I'm thinking about too, kind of these north-south solidarities, because there's so many more similarities than differences. But I think that I've also just seen it kind of, I think, reflected in some contemporary protest movements, mostly in Peru, but other places as well, where people are using dance or song as, I think it just reminded me in New Zealand, I think, the community out there during Parliament, one of the congresswomen, she did kind of a indigenous song or dance, and it just reminded me of the ways that, and in Peru, I don't know, a lot of people, there's hella songs, there's a song called Dina Asesina, which is the unelected president who's an assassin, so kind of play on words, and people love to sing that and instrument, and drum, dance, drag. So all these things that I am trying to leave room for, of like how they can also be like political acts. And then, yeah, for the second one, yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I think for when I talk about like the institutionalized left in Peru, I'm specifically kind of talking about during the internal armed conflict. Tupac Amaru was used as the mascot for the Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru, which was like a communist guerrilla group, and they carried out several massacres against travesti individuals. And so while having this very like Marxist-Leninist like politic, they were also, they like believed that like, queer people, travestis, drug users, prostitutes, sex workers, like anyone that was like kind of like a social like scourge on this idea of like a, like the leftist man, I guess. And so, yeah, something that I talk about extensively in my thesis is a lot more about this like internal armed conflict period. And like now we're 25 years post-conflict, and the very same like rhetoric is being used again of like anytime someone's like, fighting politically for like indigenous rights, like the same language of terrorism gets used on them. And so, yeah, so I think about that a lot. And then as far as like, this kind of like liberal politics, and like my actual thesis, like when I first started writing it, I started thinking about like Peru is one of the few countries in Latin America that has no like full law for like how to change your identification or your gender marker. It's one of the only countries in Latin America in comparison to Ecuador and Bolivia that has no like explicit law protecting queer and trans people from discrimination. And so I'm thinking about like, the human rights aspects of like things that we need to get done in terms of like law and policy. But also I think, just bringing it back to Vargas's work and like what I see from like queer and trans like mutual aid, efforts in Peru is like ultimately like in the neglect and like the gaps of like the neglect of the state, like people are, doing like collective housing arrangements, they're doing mutual aid, they're like doing food banks and stuff. And it's really like, women, queer, and trans people that are doing these things. So I think I'm always thinking about like how that gets translated into like legal policy and where we have to kind of like, fight and like ask the state or like beg the state for like our rights versus like building our own like networks of community and solidarity outside of it, because clearly the state is not going to protect us.
Thank you. I think we should give you a 5-minute break, but before we do, again, thank these panelists. The core court will be Sam and Vanessa.
Hello again. We are so excited and honored to introduce VCS dual degree alumni Jesus Barraza as the recipient of the 2025 Visual and Critical Studies Alumni Award. Jesus is a distinguished artist, printmaker, educator, activist, community leader, and social practitioner based in San Leandro. Currently, Barraza is a lecturer at UC Berkeley in the Ethnic Studies Department with a focus on Chicanx art history and practice, the co-founder of Dignidad Rebelde, a community-driven graphic arts collaboration that amplifies community voices, struggles, and resistances, and a member of Just Seeds Artists Cooperative. Jesus holds a BA in Rasa Studies from SF State and graduated from CCA in 2016 with an MFA in Social Practice and an MA in Visual and Critical Studies. At CCA, Jesus explored tactics of decolonial social practice and indigenous knowledge production in contemporary contexts in his VCS thesis entitled, quote, Lowriding a Social Form, Anishinaabe Grandfather Teachings as Decolonial Vehicles of Resistance.
Long before I came to study art history and way before I moved to the Bay Area, as a high schooler in 2012, my older sister first introduced me to Jesus and his co-founder Melanie Cervantes' printmaking work as Dignidad Rebelde by gifting me a couple of their prints. Their work gave visual form and weight to a number of the national and localized issues I was witnessing and was really instrumental in helping shape my own politics. Moreover, Dignidad Rebelde offered me a vision of what art could look like when it's in service to the community and accountable to the people it represents. Jesus' continued effort at Dignidad Rebelde and across other projects embody the same values he explored in his time at CCA, through, as Dignidad Rebelde states, creating art that can be put back into the hands of the communities who inspire it. Barraza's work exemplifies a sense of intergenerational and intercommunity solidarity, which we've also seen reflected in his work as an educator and mentor for next generations of printmakers and cultural workers. His work continues to remind us that artistic practice and research can be an instrument for building movements, sharing knowledge, remembering, and imagining otherwise.
Barraza's multifaceted commitment to community empowerment and social justice truly embodies the interdisciplinarity and critical labor that is at the heart of the VCS program. We are honored to inherit the legacy of Jesus' values, critical practice, dedication to his community, and passion for the work that he does. Thank you, Jesus, and so excited to introduce you for your presentation.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, how's that working? Is that good? All right. So I'm going to start by reiterating that we are on Ramatouche, Alonian land, and say that from the tip of Alaska all the way to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, this is all indigenous land, right? And I will start also by thanking the Visual and Critical Studies program for this great honor. I really appreciate it, and it feels very special to be here. And I have to say, I'm also almost as nervous as I was when I was up here last time. But now it's been 9 years since I graduated from the VCS program and was up here sharing my research. It was an amazing conclusion to all the work I put in during those years of working on my thesis and research. I always hoped that my work would become something more, maybe an article or a book. And I've always been a dreamer, and I've been trying to make the connections to make that dream come true. So it was interesting when Jackie contacted me about this. It was an honor. It was an honor, and I thought it was an excellent moment to present this new research that I've been working on. Last year, I was approached by Tere Roma, a curator in the Bay, who was working on an exhibit of posters by the Royal Chicano Air Force, the RCAF, to write an article for the exhibition catalog. And I was super excited, and as a poster artist, I've been influenced by their work, and the topic that she wanted me to write about was really perfect for me. The article was going to be about the posters of the RCAF and the Danza Azteca ceremonies that started in the 1970s. At the time, I interviewed artists, danzantes, cultural organizers. I brought in Anzalduan theory to look at the community-driven work they were doing and considering how they were forging a Chicano decolonial aesthetic through their posters and ceremonial work. I was excited to write about these ceremonies as I participated in them since my college days. And then there was a conversation. Could I switch gears? At first, I freaked out. There was talking about overlapping content and all these gaps that needed to be filled. And I was open to it. And it was really great because I ended up writing something that I really enjoyed. But I thought that the original piece I wrote could become something else. Maybe an article for a journal or for a book. But one day while I was driving, thinking about making my thesis into a book, as I'm always dreaming about, thinking about the chapters I'd like to add and what artists I would like to include, it came to me that I could take this article, whatever it was, and make it into a chapter that focused on the development of a Chicano decolonial aesthetic to start the book. And so that's where I am with this. I'm still, don't really have a title. I guess I have a title there now, so I'm thinking about that, right? But hopefully, making this into a chapter of a book that would be forthcoming. Examining the art of the RCAF with the primary focus being on posters created for these ceremonies that were reconnecting the Mexicano and Chicano communities in Sacramento with their indigenous traditions. I propose that these posters created to announce the ceremonies served as portals for the community to enter these ceremonial spaces and reconnect with ancestral traditions. In this manner, the poster makers and danzantes, the cultural workers, were helping to heal the community through cultural and artistic practices. To expand on this, I looked at the mental health work that they were doing starting in 1972. Dr. Armando Solis, who was a therapist working at the Centro de Artistas Chicanos, where the RCA was based out of, began to approach mental health work in the Mexican and Chicano community from an indigenous perspective, feeling that Western therapy was not reaching them because therapists did not understand their worldview and their way of being. The program was successful, and Dr. Solis believed that the work could be expanded. He looked at Dia los Muertos celebrations that started in 1972 at the Centro, which began with a simple altar and in the following years became a procession and community celebration. Dr. Solis suggested that to widen their approach, they could use a ceremony such as Dia los Muertos to bring community healing by integrating the knowledge and indigenous values that migrated with them from Mexico. The posters themselves don't reflect all the healing that took place, but it serves as documentation that allows people to reflect on this moment in time when the Chicano community began reconnecting with their ancestral and cultural ceremonies. I propose this was the forging of a Chicano decolonial aesthetic, and further examining the Day of the Dead ceremony from an Anzaldúa perspective, I suggest that the methodology, the social practice methodology of the RCAF was about healing from the traumas of coloniality through art and culture. And so kind of moving forward, I look to aesthetics. Reflecting on the early work of the Chicano art movement, I argue that instrumental in the work of the RCAF was their usage of indigenous imagery. Looking at stills from Luis Vanessa's film, I Am Joaquin, and his use of Mexican indigenous culture, it is clear to me that there was a move to reconnect with indigenous cultures in the 1960s. But I argue that he was using these cultures without any context, without exploring their meaning, or connecting them with any spiritual perspective. Plainly, they were being used because they were part of Chicano history. At the time, Chicanos were beginning to understand their indigeneity, and just seeing these images brought a sense of reconnection with something that had been stolen from them. What I see in the 1970s posters of the RCAF is a connection between the imagery used, such as the corn here in the poster for the Fiesta del Maíz. This ceremony was for the young women as they transitioned from womanhood, and later becomes known as the Sloane ceremony. We see the corn, a plant that was first domesticated around 9,000 years ago by indigenous people in what becomes now Mexico. Corn becomes a staple of indigenous people throughout the Americas, an ancestral food that 9,000 years later is still fundamental in the culinary practices of Mexicans and Chicanos. From tacos to tamales, we've been eating this food for thousands of years. The poster used the corn to represent the Sloane, or the corn goddess, growing out from the earth, as we are people of the earth. The poster was a portal into the ceremony, a way for people to learn about these ceremonies and the worldview they carry. Now the danza ceremony posters are the most sought after because of the significance they represented to the people, and they still hold for them as a memory of those ceremonies. And as I mentioned, the Fiesta del Maíz is a Sloane ceremony for young women. These are some of the young women who participated in 1979. And during my interviews, I spoke with Lupe Portillo, a cultural worker from the RCAF, whose main responsibility was and continues to be the building of the community altar for Dia los Muertos. When talking with her, she spoke of her involvement with the Sloane, from participating in the ceremony as a dancer in the 70s, to bringing her daughter into that circle in the 1990s, and now presenting her granddaughter as a Sloane. This is 3 generations that have been part of the ceremony over the past 50 years and reconnected with their ancestral traditions. The healing these ceremonies have brought to the community, helping generations deal with the alienation felt in this Western society. And as Dr. Solis believed with Day of the Dead, we see the ceremony helping people reconnect with an indigenous worldview and heal from the colonial traumas of the past 500 years. With this image on the right, we see the corn maiden not just as an empty symbol, but a reflection of the young women who have been through the Sloane ceremony. Unlike early Chicano art, these posters use imagery that reflects a worldview and an indigenous spirituality in a material way. In this poster for the Fiesta de Colores, or the springtime ceremony, we see the image of Tlaloc here at the top, the god of rain. The connection to the ceremony is clear. Spring brings the rain, and Tlaloc is the one responsible for bringing that rain. The poster represents a ceremony, and it helped the community learn about Tlaloc and his role in the ceremony as the bringer of rain and in society, helping the Chicano community learn about an indigenous worldview and a way to reconnect with ancestral traditions. As I wrap this up, I want to share where I am on my research, looking to the ways in which the RCA's art served to inspire the generations that followed. Artists like myself have used their methodology, their social practice methodology, to make work that continues to connect the Chicano community with an indigenous worldview. And so I'm closing with my image of Tlaloc, and give thanks to the RCAEF for passing down, again, their social practice methodology, their way of working in community to heal colonial trauma. And for me, most important, the way that they influenced me through their posters, this piece being directly influenced by the prior image. When I first created this image, I looked at that Fiesta poster and it helped me see beyond colonial aesthetics and value the spiritual significance of the grain god today. Here I used Tlaloc to explore contemporary political issues from an indigenous worldview. This poster was made to honor the struggle of indigenous people fighting for public access to water in Bolivia, where even the rain was taken from the people, just as the Israeli genocide machine does to indigenous Palestinians in Gaza today. I use the image of Tlaloc to demonstrate how this struggle is an indigenous struggle on many lands. It was these first pilots of the Royal Chicano Air Force that passed down something to me that I am now writing about, and as an artist, passing down to the generation of Chicanx artists who are coming down the pipeline. And so with that, I'm going to close it up and say thank you again, and long live Free Palestine.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentations and congratulations. All right, we have come nearly to the end, as I'm sure is the case with many of you who are family and friends to these VCS scholars, you who have seen their hard work over recent years. I am so proud of them today. We put them through tough tests, and I have to applaud their efforts. So let's go. Their presentations highlight the importance of rigorous research, informed interpretation, and historical writing about art, object making, and cultural production. Their scholarship tells us much about culture, how it's made, who makes it, where it's found, why it's important. All of the students have so skillfully demonstrated why we all appreciate, consume, and need art and other forms of visual culture, especially those works that powerfully express ideas and concerns and problematize them. We congratulate the VCS class of 2025 on their spring symposium presentations, and we welcome back Professor Jesus Barraza, Fine Arts MFA and MA in Visual Critical Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today. All that we've heard today has been so inspiring and empowering. Let's celebrate your achievements over, finally, refreshments and a toast. Thank you so much.